Mr. Speaker, to ask the Prime Minister if he will refer the conduct of the Secretary of State for Culture, Olympics, Media and Sport in respect of his dealings with News Corporation to the independent adviser on ministerial interests.
As was made clear in his statement last Wednesday, in every respect with regard to the News Corporation bid, the Culture Secretary asked for independent advice and acted on it. He was not required to ask or to follow such advice, but he did so. He acted fairly and impartially and in line with the advice of his permanent secretary. I've seen no evidence to suggest that in handling this issue, the Secretary of State acted at any stage in a way that was contrary to the ministerial code. The permanent secretary of the department approved the approach his department took to the quasi-judicial process, which included a small number of people acting as contact points with News Corporation, as is required and normal in such a process. However, it is quite clear that this contact became improper and inappropriate and went beyond the requirements set out by the Secretary of State or the Permanent Secretary. That is why the Special Adviser resigned, and he was right to do so. Now, of course, it is not for Lord Justice Leveson to determine whether a minister has broken the ministerial code. That is an issue for me, and I will deal with it properly. In order to do this, it is neither necessary nor right to have a parallel investigation that could duplicate, cut across, or possibly preempt what Lord Justice Leveson is doing. Like other party leaders in our country for decades, I have tried to convince media outlets to support the policies of my party and now my government. But let me be clear, there never has been any grand bargain between the Conservative Party and Rupert or James Murdoch. I have to say, if that was the case, while I respect him deeply, what on earth was I doing making the Right Honourable Member for Twickenham the Business Secretary responsible for this?
The reason why it was essential for the Prime Minister to come to the House today is that the Culture Secretary is in clear breach of the ministerial code. And the Prime Minister stands by and does nothing. The Culture Secretary would have us believe that his special adviser was on a freelance mission. 6 months of daily emails, texts, leaks, and the leaking of confidential information about what opposing parties were saying. On one of the biggest media bids for decades, is the Prime Minister really reduced to the news of the world defence? One rogue individual acting alone. And, Mr. Speaker, if the Culture Secretary really was that clueless about the biggest issue facing his department, he should be sacked anyway. The Special Adviser had to go to protect the Culture Secretary. The Culture Secretary has to stay to protect the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has shown today he is incapable of doing his duty, too close to a powerful few, out of touch with everyone else.
Weak and wrong. 15 years of secret meetings, pyjama parties, christenings and all the rest of it, and not one word of apology. My right honourable friend took responsibility, came to the House, explained what had happened and gave a full account of himself. And while we're on the subject of ministers taking responsibility for their special advisers, can anyone remember a minister taking responsibility for Charlie Whelan? Can you remember that? Can you remember anyone taking responsibility for Damien McBride? Can you remember that? What a lot of self-serving double standards we had from the party opposite. Let me just make two further points. He says this is an issue of judgment about what steps to take. Let us examine briefly what the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party's judgment was. She was asked very specifically, you called for the Secretary of State's resignation within 23 minutes of the evidence being provided to the Leveson inquiry. She was asked very specifically, did you read that evidence? And she said, no, I didn't need to. Why didn't you need to, she was asked. She said, because I heard the evidence of James Murdoch. So that's it. He is the arbiter of standards and the ministerial code.